Dylan froze mid-verse. His fingers stopped on the strings. And a single voice from the darkness broke 40 years of silence. The Orpheum Theater. Minneapolis. October 1997. A small venue, 250 seats, with floors that creaked, walls that remembered a century of performances. Dylan had chosen it deliberately. No arenas. No stadiums. Just a room where sound could breathe and silence could mean something. He was 3 songs into the set. Don't think twice, it's all right. A song he'd sung 10,000 times across 5 decades. The words came automatically now, muscle memory older than most people in the audience. His fingers moved across the strings. The harmonica sat ready on its rack. The spotlight made his shadow long against the back curtain. 250 people sat in darkness, listening. He reached the second verse. It ain't no use in turning on your light, babe, / that light I never knowed. And then he stopped. Not a pause for breath. Not a dramatic rest. A complete stop. His left hand went still on the fretboard. His right hand hovered above the strings, not striking, not moving. His mouth stayed open on an unfinished syllable. The audience waited. This was Dylan. He did things. He changed arrangements. He stopped and started. They'd learned to wait. But this was different. Dylan's head turned slowly toward the back of the theater. Toward the darkness beyond the last row of seats where the exit signs glowed red. His eyes, barely visible beneath the brim of his hat, were focused on something no one else could see yet. 10 seconds of silence. In a concert hall, 10 seconds feels like drowning. Then a voice called from the darkness. Old. Female. Cracked with age but steady with purpose. Bobby. Not Dylan. Not Mr. Dylan. Bobby. The name his mother had used. The name Hibbing, Minnesota had known him by before the world learned different. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. The Orpheum's house lights stayed down. Dylan's guitarist, Larry Campbell, looked over from stage right, concerned, waiting for a cue that didn't come. The bass player had stopped mid-note. The drummer held his stick suspended. Dylan lowered his guitar slowly. Not setting it down, just letting it hang from the strap, his hands falling to his sides. He took one step back from the microphone. Then another. Creating distance between himself and the performance, between the persona and whatever was happening now. Bobby, the voice said again. It's Esther. Someone in the third row turned around, trying to locate the source. A murmur rippled through the audience. Confusion, curiosity, that uncomfortable feeling when the script breaks and no one knows what comes next. Dylan stood perfectly still. The spotlight caught the dust in the air around him. His shadow stretched longer. He was 66 years old. He'd been performing for 40 years. He'd been Dylan, the voice of a generation, the poet laureate of American disillusionment, for so long that Bobby Zimmerman felt like a character from someone else's life. But Esther Cohen knew Bobby Zimmerman. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1957. Hibbing, Minnesota. Iron Range country. Mining town. Population 16,000. Bob Zimmerman was 16 years old, skinny, weird, obsessed with Little Richard and Hank Williams, playing piano in a band called the Golden Chords that nobody took seriously. He was also angry. At Hibbing. At the flatness of Minnesota. At the predictable future the town had waiting for him, college maybe, or work in the mines like his father, marriage to a local girl, a house 3 blocks from where he grew up, the whole suffocating circle of small-town inevitability. Esther Cohen was his English teacher. 53 years old. Never married. Taught at Hibbing High School for 26 years. She lived in a small house filled with books, listened to classical music on a record player that skipped, and saw something in the angry kid who wrote strange poetry in the margins of his homework. She gave him books. Not the assigned curriculum. Dylan skipped most of that anyway. Real books. Rimbaud. Whitman. Ginsberg. She'd slip them to him after class with a knowing look and say, "Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are, Bobby." He'd read them in his bedroom, windows open to the Minnesota cold, feeling for the first time that maybe anger wasn't weakness. Maybe it was fuel. Maybe the cage wasn't permanent. In the spring of 1957, Dylan wrote a poem. Not for class. Just for himself. About leaving. About becoming someone else. About killing Bobby Zimmerman so something bigger could be born. It was melodramatic the way 16-year-old art always is, but it was also true. He was planning his escape from Hibbing, from Minnesota, from everything that felt like drowning. He showed it to Esther Cohen one afternoon after school. She read it standing by the classroom window, late sun coming through, dust in the air just like tonight at the Orpheum 40 years later. When she finished, she looked at him for a long time. Then she said something Dylan would carry for the rest of his life. "You're going to leave here, Bobby. You should. The world needs you more than Hibbing does. But promise me something." "What?" "When you become who you're going to become, don't forget who you were. Don't lose Bobby completely. He's the one who feels things. He's the one who's angry enough to tell the truth." Dylan shrugged with all the arrogance of 16. "I won't forget." "You will," she said, not unkindly. "Everyone does. The higher you go, the harder it gets to remember the ground. But try anyway." He left Hibbing in 1959. Changed his name to Bob Dylan. Started performing in Minneapolis, then New York. The folk scene. The protest songs. The electric betrayal at Newport. The motorcycle accident. The hermit years. The gospel period. The never-ending tour. He became Dylan. And Bobby Zimmerman, the angry kid from Hibbing, became a ghost story he barely remembered. Esther Cohen retired from teaching in 1978. Moved to Minneapolis to be near her sister. Dylan heard about it years later from someone who knew someone. He thought about reaching out. Writing a letter maybe. But what would he say? And to which version of himself would she be writing back? So he didn't. The years passed. Bobby stayed buried. Dylan kept performing. Until tonight. October 1997. When an 83-year-old woman stood in the back of the Orpheum Theater and called him by his first name. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. The audience was restless now. Whispers growing louder. Someone in the balcony called out, "Is everything okay?" Dylan didn't respond. He was staring into the darkness where Esther's voice had come from. Larry Campbell leaned toward him. "Bob? You want to take 5? Dylan shook his head slowly. "No. Not 5 minutes. Not a break. Something else." He walked to the edge of the stage. Not to his left where the wings waited. Not to his right toward the equipment. Straight forward, to where the stage met the audience, to where the lights ended and the darkness began. The theater manager appeared from the side door, confused, wondering if there was a medical emergency. Security moved toward the back of the hall. Dylan raised one hand, not a wave, not a gesture, just a signal. "Wait. Esther," Dylan said into his microphone, his voice rough, barely more than speaking volume. "Are you really there?" Movement in the darkness. An elderly woman stood slowly from a seat in the back row. House lights stayed down, but exit sign glow caught her profile, white hair, thin frame, a coat too big for her shoulders. She leaned on a cane. "I'm here, Bobby." The audience had gone completely silent. 250 people holding their breath, understanding without explanation that they were witnessing something private, something that shouldn't be interrupted. Dylan climbed down from the stage. No one had ever seen him do this. In 40 years of performing, Dylan stayed on stage. He stood behind microphones. He kept the distance. The barrier between performer and audience was sacred, necessary, the thing that let him be Dylan instead of Bobby. But now he was walking up the center aisle. His boots on the old wood floor. His shadow following him in reverse from the stage lights behind. The audience parted instinctively, people pulling their knees back to let him through. He reached the back row. Esther Cohen stood there, both hands on her cane now, supporting herself. 83 years old. Face lined with decades Dylan hadn't witnessed. Eyes that still had that knowing look from the classroom 40 years ago. They stood 3 feet apart. The entire theater watching. The band on stage frozen. Time doing that strange expansion it does when moments become memory while they're still happening. "You came," Dylan said. Not a question. A statement of fact that felt like wonder. "I had to," Esther said. "I read you were playing here. Small venue. I thought." She smiled slightly. "I thought maybe I could reach you. Before I can't anymore." Dylan understood. Age. Mortality. The closing window of possible conversations. "I'm sick, Bobby," Esther said, and her voice was steady but her hands trembled on the cane. "The doctors say months, maybe less. And I needed to know something before I go." "What? Did you keep your promise? Did you remember Bobby? Or did Dylan eat him completely?" Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. For 40 years, Dylan had built walls. Against journalists who wanted confessions. Against fans who wanted their profit. Against anyone who tried to make him explain the gap between the angry kid and the legend. He'd learned to deflect, to redirect, to disappear into metaphor and myth. But standing in the back of the Orpheum Theater, 3 feet from the woman who'd given him Rimbaud and told him not to become small, he did something he hadn't done since 1959. He told the truth. "I forgot him," Dylan said. "Almost completely. I buried Bobby so deep I couldn't find him if I tried. You were right. The higher I went, the more he disappeared." Esther nodded. Not surprised. Not disappointed. Just listening. "There were years," Dylan continued, his voice quiet enough that the audience had to strain to hear, "when I couldn't remember why I was angry. Couldn't remember what I was fighting against. I became the thing people needed me to be. The poet. The prophet. The voice. And Bobby with his bad haircut and his cheap guitar and his rage against Hibbing, he became a stranger." The audience was crying. Not everyone. But enough. People who understood what it costs to become the person everyone else needs. "But you know what's strange?" Dylan said, and for the first time something like a smile touched his face. "Tonight, when you said my name, I felt 16 again. I felt that anger. That hunger to escape. That certainty that the world was bigger than what they told me it was. You brought him back, Esther. Just by saying his name." Esther's hand shook harder on her cane. Dylan reached out instinctively, steadying her elbow. The gesture small, human, completely un-Dylan. "I have something for you," Esther said. She reached into her coat pocket with difficulty, pulled out a folded piece of paper. Old. Yellowed. Creased from years of being carried. "The poem you showed me," she said, handing it to him. "Spring 1957. About leaving. About becoming someone else. I kept it, Bobby. I've carried it for 40 years. I wanted you to have it back. So you could remember who wrote it." Dylan took the paper. Unfolded it carefully. His own handwriting from 4 decades ago. The teenage melodrama. The raw anger. The prophecy that turned out true. He read it standing there in the back of the theater, while 250 people watched in silence. And when he finished, he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said. "Play something for me," Esther said. Not Dylan. Not the voice of a generation. Bobby. Play something Bobby would play. Something angry and true and unfinished. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. Dylan walked back down the aisle. Climbed onto the stage. Picked up his guitar. The band stayed silent, waiting. He didn't return to the microphone. He sat on the edge of the stage, legs hanging over, guitar in his lap. Facing Esther in the darkness. And he played. Not Don't Think Twice. Not a classic. Something raw. Unfinished. A melody he'd written at 16 and never recorded. Something Bobby Zimmerman had felt before Dylan learned to perform. He played for 3 minutes. No words. Just guitar. Angry and tender and true. When the last note faded, Esther nodded once. Then she turned and walked slowly toward the exit, cane tapping on wood. Dylan watched her go. The audience stayed silent. She died 6 weeks later. Dylan kept the poem in his guitar case. Every night on tour, he'd see it before performing. A reminder that Bobby Zimmerman still existed somewhere beneath the legend. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. At Esther's funeral, Dylan sent flowers. The card read only. He remembered. Bobby. The night at the Orpheum was never officially recorded. But everyone there carried it. The night Dylan stopped being Dylan long enough to be human.